Hi gaming guys, and welcome to episode 26 of Weekend Warriors, the review series for the sports cars, sports coupes, luxury coupes, convertibles. It's a very broad category, the term of sports car. It really covers a lot of ground, and in this particular pick we are featuring a slightly more conventional idea of what makes a sports car. 2 doors, 2 seats, relatively compact. Not necessarily an insane amount of power, but reasonably good power and reasonably low weight. And it's that relatively broad categorization that really defines most sports cars. There are of course notable exceptions, especially with larger sports coupes, which encroaches on stuff like luxury vehicles and also to some degree modern muscle cars. Now this particular vehicle is of course the Lotus Evora. This was a car which kind of showed that Lotus was feeling a bit more confident in themselves. Now since the Evora, they've started producing other variations of other vehicles, bringing them up to the same kind of quality as the Evora. But back when they brought this car out in 2009, or around that kind of time, it wasn't really like anything else that they were currently producing. Lotus had become kind of known for, to some degree, what they've always been known for, but with some exceptions. And that is relatively affordable, not necessarily with a huge amount of luxury or kit put into them. That's never really been the point of Lotus vehicles for the most part, but small, compact, a lot of fun, not necessarily a huge amount of power, but more focused on just attainable, fun driving, maybe with a slight inclination towards track use in some cases, such as with the Exige, or probably one of my personal favourite Lotus models, the 340R. Now this particular model, as well as some that preceded it, like the Esprit notably, was a much more upmarket approach to producing a Lotus. And they took a gamble on the Evora, and it paid off, because the Evora is now a really, really popular car. Now, it doesn't sell millions upon millions, because that's not Lotus's way. But as far as Lotus models go, it got people talking about them even more, and that is never a bad thing for a company. So the question is, what does this, in effect, more upmarket, slightly more exotic Lotus have to offer? Because whereas most of the Elans, Elises, etc. tend to be pretty reasonably priced, and also have a modest spec, the Evora really takes a big jump. It's much more in the kind of territory that you'd usually expect from something like an Esprit. Well, for 100 grand you'd hope that it's a pretty good car, because that's a lot of cash for a vehicle that at the end of the day, from the factory at least, is only producing roughly the same kind of power as what is quoted. It's not entirely accurate, but it's quoted from some JDM cars like Supras, RX-7s and Skylines. 100 grand for a vehicle with that kind of power doesn't really sound like a great deal, but being a Lotus, it's a lot lighter than those kind of vehicles would typically be. So for 100 grand, which is pretty serious money, does it offer a good package? Well, the engine for a start is significantly larger than most other modern Lotuses, at least of the time. They've started producing larger engine vehicles now. Even the Exige has a much larger engine than it used to have. But when the Evora was released, Lotus wasn't really making cars with an engine as big as this one. And even this one's only a 3.5 litre. Now it's a naturally aspirated mid-mounted unit on the game. It's rear-wheel drive, and fully tuned it puts out pretty good numbers. 536 horsepower and 422 foot-pounds of torque are not bad at all for a naturally aspirated 6-cylinder 3.5 litre engine. That's a pretty good engine. Now you put that into a vehicle which, when tuned, weighs 1,088 kilos, and you could potentially have yourself a gem. And on top of those already impressive specs, you have nearly 500 horsepower per tonne, which is pretty good for a sports car. The PP is reasonably high at 573. That is the kind of territory that you're starting to look at vehicles like some lower level GT cars, certainly some touring cars. So that would indicate that this should be a pretty good vehicle if the PP itself is anything to go by. So the question is it? Well, yes, I would say the Evora is a very good performance car. Now, like many Lotus models, it's my personal view at least that people kind of have a rose-tinted view of Lotus cars. Lotus is probably synonymous really with handling. That's what people know them for. When you see vehicles like Protons with "handling engineered by Lotus" as the slogan, or when you think of good handling cars, especially from days gone by, you're probably thinking of stuff like the Lotus Elise. That's the typical response to that kind of question. But the reality is, at least for me personally, that's, as I said, kind of a rose-tinted view. Yes, they do have good handling, but at the same time they can be quite temperamental vehicles, especially when you tune them, because as they are, as we already said, generally quite modest power vehicles. You're not looking at silly numbers from Lotus Elises, Lotus Elans, and even vehicles which they did produce more power with, like the Carlton or the Esprit. Even they don't have silly amounts of power. They have a lot of power, of course, around 350, 380 or so, but compared to many other companies, that's still not a huge amount. It's more about what Lotus can do with the specs that they're given than the specs themselves being shockingly good, because they're just not shockingly good. They're pretty good, but it's what their cars do with those numbers that makes them so legendary. But at the same time, as I said, I find them quite temperamental vehicles, especially the smaller ones. They can be very twitchy, especially when you start putting more power into them, and even with race upgrades, they can still bite back around corners. And although you could say, well, yes, of course they do, well, first of all, of course, the game isn't completely realistic, but even in the game, with its unrealistic physics, other similar vehicles, some of which were even inspired by or engineered by the same people as Lotus cars, such as the Vauxhall VX220, I would say handle better than Lotus cars. So it's kind of weird how temperamental they can be. That being said, the Evora is a new age Lotus. The handling on this car, I would say, is actually something more akin to something like a Honda NSX. It's not necessarily as quick as that around, say, the Nürburgring Ring, but overall, this car is definitely worth checking out. So that's it for this pick overall. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.